Welcome to this evening's session, when we're going to be, well, we've got a real treat. We're going to be three scholars here discussing the recent publication by Thea Gomelauri on the Lailashi Codex, which I could do like Liz Truss, hold it up upside down, turn it the wrong way around. And each speaker will be speaking for about 20 minutes, and I'll be introducing them one by one. But to start with, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Ori Soltes, who's Professor of Jewish Civilisation at Georgetown University. He teaches across a range of disciplines, from art history and theology to philosophy and political history. And he's the former director of the B'nai B'rith Klutznick National Jewish Museum. He's curated a huge number of exhibitions and authored a considerable number of books as well, most recently welcoming the Stranger Abrahamic Hospitality and its Contemporary Implications with Rachel Stern. So I'll just invite now Professor Soltes to begin, and then afterwards I'll introduce the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you everyone for being here. And I'm going to start by the coastline of Georgia, which forms the backdrop for the commentary that I have to offer, that I've been asked to offer, which is basically, what does the Lailashi Codex have to do with me, or what do I have to do with it? And the answer to that goes back some 25 years, when I had the pleasure of encountering Georgia for the first time as a land of history and myth, a land which has an association in the Western tradition going back to the stories that the Greeks told about Jason and the Argonauts, and coming to the land of Soltes, where he was to get the golden fleece and was helped to do so by the sorceress and priestess Medea, who betrayed her father in order to help him get away. And one wonders, because Soltes is on the eastern coast of the Black Sea, it's the western part of Georgia, what reality there might have been behind that. And it turns out that the Rioni River flowing into the Black Sea has had sparks of gold that just were leached out from the mineral content of the riverbed. And if you put, quite literally, a sheep's coat into the water, it would pick this up, and you lay it out in the sun, let it dry out, and you've got a little bit of gold. So that might have been the historical reality behind the myth. But there is no myth with respect to the absolute gorgeousness of Georgia, from the sea to the mountains. And I've chosen this particular image of the mountains not by accident, because it's the area in the middle of the country in which you have embedded a little town called Lailash, which you can see the Lailash village here. And what you're seeing here on this particular map is different pieces of the story of the Lailashi Codex. And my association with it, as I said, goes back 25 years ago, when I was in Georgia for the first time, because I was in the process of organizing two rather substantial exhibitions. One was on Georgian history and culture, 8,000 years worth, in which there were many emphases, because there is so much to emphasize in the history of Georgia with respect to its culture and its art and its artifacts, metallurgy that began more than 5,000 years ago, viticulture, the cultivating of the vines to produce wine that began on the southern slopes of the Caucasus much further back than that. And over the course of the centuries, just magnificent work in all kinds of media. I have argued in the past that it was the Georgians and not the Greeks who tutored the Scythians in the metallurgical work for which they then became famous, or I should say became famous 23 centuries after they were doing it in the West, and in many other respects. But the second exhibition was about the history of Georgian Jewry, where Georgia has shown itself over the course of history to be a warmly embracing country with respect to the Jews, in spite of being arguably the first. I will, in truth, in advertising, admit that the Armenians make the same claim, and I'm not going to adjudicate between them. but the first country to embrace Christianity as its official religion. And the story of the conversion process is very distinct. I'm not going to go into it. But the point is, it has a rich Christian history on the one hand. And on the other hand, it has always been hospitable to Jewry on the second hand. And the image here of Mitzcheta, which is an earlier capital than Tbilisi is, and it happens to be of a particular church on a hill overlooking Mitzcheta, is also arguably the first place where Jews settled in Georgia. Or let me be more precise, Judeans, because the idea of Georgian Jewish history is that its beginnings came during the time of the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem and the exile to Babylonia, and Judeans then came to Georgia. And the Georgian Christian perspective on why it's never had anti-Semitism is associated with their embrace of that same idea. And they say, well, the Jews were here 500 years before the crucifixion. So whatever other Christians think about Jewish culpability in the matter of the death of Christ, clearly Georgian Jews cannot have been part of that because they were here too long before in order for that to have happened. But I have to say that the role of Georgia as a country that offers a centuries-long model of interfaith embrace and more than tolerance is not just expressed vis-a-vis the Jews. Georgia is situated kind of on the border between the Christian and Muslim worlds. And it is at its peak during the period of the Crusades. It's a perfect opportunity for the Georgians to have been part of a Christian anti-Muslim vanguard in conjunction with, association with, and consistency with the way the Crusades operated, but that was not the case. When Georgian Christians defeated Muslims and were able to push, it was the Persian Muslims, out of the picture during their peak, the mosques weren't destroyed, the mosques continued. The Muslims stayed on. It's just that the leadership changed from being Muslim, not Georgian, to Christian Georgian. And to me, the ultimate symbol and symptom of that is that the national medieval epic, The Knight in the Panther's Skin, by Shota Rustaveli, is a work in which the heroes, as well as the bad guys, well, there aren't any really, really bad guys. They're all Muslim of different sorts. So it's not an epic that one might expect from that era, let's suppose, in which you've got a set of Christian heroes and whoever the bad guys are, let's say, Muslim. Doesn't work that way. So the Georgians have a long history of being blind to those kinds of prejudices. So the second exhibition was focused in part on the history of the Jews in Georgia. The late 19th century, when the Zionist idea was developing and Georgian Jews were quite taken with it, there was never a sense on the part of Georgian Christians that there was something wrong with Georgian Jews feeling simultaneously an intense love and loyalty of Georgia and an intense interest in Zion, in Palestine. I'm showing you this map for two reasons. One, you can see the distance between Georgia and what is now Israel, that was then Palestine, then governed by the Ottomans. But I'm also showing it to you because if you look at the writing on it, you'll notice that 169 folios of the Lailashi Codex were found in Georgia, and only recently another 3 folios turned up in Jerusalem. How they got there is in and of itself a partial mystery. But here's the thing. The Lailashi Codex, which offers, and we're going to hear more about it from Geoffrey Kahn in a few moments, the Lailashi Codex offers this spectacular and nearly complete, before the discovery of these additional folios, now virtually complete, Pentateuch, Torah, the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and it serves as a kind of symbol at one and the same time, and so it would have had a role in the 2 exhibitions that I was curating and that I was hoping to bring to the United States, and in the end, because of internal politics, in Georgia at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century. Neither exhibition came to the States. In both cases, the catalogs and one of the 8,000 years of Georgian history and culture catalog is enormous. They were fortunately completed before everything fell apart because of internal politics, and it was enormously disappointing. But this was my opportunity to meet the Lailashi Codex, so to speak, in the flesh, and it would have been a wonderful opportunity to see it being seen in two different capacities in the United States. It seems to me, a symbol, above all, of the unique relationship that the Jewish community of Georgia has had with the larger Georgian reality over the centuries. And so here is a kind of air view of the mountainous area you saw from a different angle earlier, that again locates Lailashi among these different towns and villages, kind of in the middle of nowhere. Here's a beautiful view of Lailashi and its pool of water. And of course, the obvious question is, how did it get there? Was it created there? Was it created elsewhere? This extraordinary text, the text is just the Pentateuch. By extraordinary, I mean calligraphy. So you're looking here, of course, as a kind of sweep of some of the pages, and you can see even they were folded together, folded together, folded together. That's why you even have the empty spaces that are identical in this particular page. And it offers the oldest example of a complete Pentateuch in Hebrew with a beautiful style of script and Masoretic. The Masoretes are the group that introduced vowel notation into the Hebrew Bible, when after all, Hebrew that had once upon a time been everybody's spoken language, as it is today in Israel, so you don't need vowels. But you do in the in-between centuries, when it has been reduced to a language of liturgy and scholarship, to make it easier to read for people for whom it's not their native language, who would automatically know how to read most of it anyway, but also little diacritical marks that help you understand how to chant it. And the thing about this codex is, you can see it's not just the beauty of the script itself, all of these wonderful, intricate workings around the peripheries and the interiors of pages, which of course we call micrography, and you're going to hear more about micrography from Debra Band also in just a few moments. In a nutshell, of course, micrography is, as the Latin-based word sounds, tiny letters, small letters. And whereas, if I can make a comparison, the Arabic writing system developed a whole range of 6 major and about another dozen and a half minor styles of distorting Arabic letters for aesthetic purposes. So we speak of it as beautiful writing, calligraphy. Hebrew didn't tend to go that way. Hebrew instead took the text and turned it into an image, and turned images into texts by tiny letters that typically offer some sort of a narration. And the challenge to the viewer, of course, is to find where the beginning is and follow it. So the Lailashi is completely filled with this magnificent works, of course, abstract, by no means figurative, certainly not in the pages of the Pentateuch of the Torah, although even to have a Pentateuch with all of this illumination and illustration is itself extraordinary. And in some cases, we even have add icing to the cake, the handling of color as well. So it's a spectacular work, which was missing one of its teeth, you know? And when those last folios were shown up, now we've got the complete smile. And of course, Thea worked on this and has produced this magnificent book. What makes it so extraordinary is its age. What makes it so extraordinary is the mystery of its provenance. What makes it so extraordinary is that it's a perfect storm of wonder and magnificence. And that's why I was thirsting for it 25 years ago, and that's why I'm thrilled to be part of this program. And I'm happy to hand the baton back to Ben so that he can introduce Geoffrey as our program moves forward. Thank you also very much for your listening.
So I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, who's somebody I know very well, Professor Geoffrey Khan, FBA, the Regius Professor of Hebrew in Cambridge. And if we all raise our hands simultaneously, maybe he'll change his mind about retiring next year and continue to delight us with his discoveries about the Tiberian pronunciation tradition. His research publications, as many people will know, focus on three main fields: biblical Hebrew, Neo-Aramaic. I mean, you could just listing his Neo-Aramaic books alone would take some time, and medieval Arabic documents. His most recent books are about the impact of Iranian on Neo-Aramaic and Arabic documents from medieval Nubia, showing his range, even at this stage of his career. Anyway, it's with great pleasure that Geoffrey, I hand over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Ben. So what I'm going to do is, I mean, Ori gave a very nice introduction. I'm going to follow on with a bit, sort of focusing specifically on the text or the general contextualization of the Lailashi Codex within other Bible codices of the period. Now, the first thing I want to say is that the Lailashi Codex is clearly what's known as a medieval model Tiberian codex. And so therefore it belongs to the category of medieval Bible manuscripts, such as the Aleppo Codex, which was one of the most famous codexes, and the so-called Codex Leningradensis, that's just one Firkovich B19A in St. Petersburg, which is the base of the scholarly BHS edition of the Hebrew Bible, which most students use to study biblical Hebrew. So as you see, it generically resembles these manuscripts in having 3 columns and with Masoretic notes in the margins. So with the Aleppo Codex, the Codex Leningradensis, are 2 of the most famous medieval manuscripts. They're not the same date. I mean, the Aleppo Codex is earlier, the 10th century. The Codex Leningradensis is 11th century. Some of the other famous medieval model Masoretic codices, basically codices with 3 columns, are the so-called B manuscript, which is British Library or 4445, which scholars believe is essentially roughly the same date as the Aleppo Codex. And then we have the Cairo Codex of the Prophets, which the date of which is not quite so clear, is actually probably roughly the equivalent of the Codex Leningradensis, the 11th century, rather than earlier. So they're some of the most famous manuscripts. There are lots of other model Masoretic codices, many of them in St. Petersburg. Then we have many fragments of them in the Cairo Geniza. So that is the general category to which the Lailashi Codex belongs. Now, the point is, if you pan back a bit from the model Masoretic, Tiberian Masoretic codices, in the medieval world, there were many, many other sorts of Bible manuscripts. First of all, there are manuscripts written in different vocalization traditions, such as the Babylonian vocalization. Here we have a manuscript in the Babylonian. Then we have other manuscripts in the so-called Palestinian vocalization. And we should pause and just very briefly say, well, not take for granted it's a codex. Where does the codex come from in the medieval world? Well, if you go back into antiquity, in the Second Temple period, Bibles were written on scrolls, but and scrolls, of course, continue to be written through the Middle Ages. But the codex was introduced in the Middle Ages under the influence of Islamic environment, apparently under the influence of the model of the Quran. And here we have essentially a contemporary Quranic manuscript from roughly the same period as the Aleppo Codex. So this, by the way, is a fragment from the Geniza of the oldest dated codex, a leaf of a codex, dated to the 10th century, which does seem to be modeled on Quranic manuscripts due to its shape. So that's just a sort of general sort of contextualization. Finally, apart from the so-called model manuscripts with Tiberian vocalization, there are lots and lots of so-called non-model manuscripts in the Middle Ages, typically not written in 3 columns, often just simply written in small format with some text in 1 column. My former PhD student, Estara Arant, has done some very important work on these non-model codices in the Geniza. And here we have another few more examples of these non-model codices. So clearly, the Lailashi Codex belongs to the model category. Finally, in manuscripts which are model or near model, here we have one with 2 columns rather than 3. We sometimes get a different sort of what we call extended or non-standard form of Tiberian vocalization. That's another category of manuscripts. But the Lailashi Codex belongs to the standard vocalization tradition of Tiberian vocalization. Okay, so let's now, having established that the Lailashi Codex belongs to the category of model Tiberian codices, how is it different from, or how does it group, or how does it typologically compare with the other extant model Masoretic codices? Well, the point about the standard Tiberian tradition and the model Masoretic codices is that they are very, very carefully copied, and they're very accurately copied, and therefore there is minimal variation in the text in terms of spelling, the orthography, and also in the vocalization. Now, the one dimension in which these model codices differ are, if you like, extra textual dimensions, such as the Masoretic notes. Virtually every model Masoretic codex has a slightly different sort of profile of Masoretic notes. My student Vince Byler has been working on these in the model Masoretic codices, and he showed very carefully very impressively, how one can start to group manuscripts according to their profile of Masoretic notes. Now, and also, of course, they differ in variety of ways of decorations, which Debra will talk about. And you know, this wonderful micrography is one of the distinctive features which distinguishes this from other Masoretic codices. It's not the only codex with micrography, of course, but these are the ways, and extra textually they differ. I want to, you know, I'm a philologist, and I'd like to focus in on the textual side and see how do model Masoretic codices differ textually among each other. So here we've got the L, the Codex Leningradensis is referred to as L typically. And here are some of the ways in which these model codices differ. One of them is the placement of the so-called major Gaia. The major Gaia, sometimes referred to as meteg, but the Masoretic term is Gaia, is a vertical stroke on a syllable which is typically 2 syllables back from the main stress. So here, ha-adam, you can see on the hey here, we have a Gaia. Now, the point is, in the model Masoretic codices, the marking of major Gaia is not consistent. It differs across codices, and the different patterns of marking. Also, the marking of the Gaia on the verbs haya and haya, and the prefixes of verbs haya and haya, places like yihye, yihye, vaihi, all of those in the first syllable has a Gaia, but the marking of Gaia on those verbs is not consistent across codices. And then thirdly, we have the marking of chatif signs under non-guttural consonants, like tochalenu on the kaf versus tochalenu. Now, in actual fact, both in the Tiberian reading tradition, they were pronounced exactly the same, except the notation is different. Now, codices differ in that respect as well. Also, within the Tiberian school, there were 2 major Masoretes in the last generation, Ben Asher and Ben Naphtali, and they differed in various ways in how they read the text, how they read in very small details. And the surviving Masoretic codex differs in the ways in which these they conform to Ben Asher or Ben Naphtali's readings. So where does the Lailashi Codex where does it sort of locate itself in terms of these various different variants? So here, this is just a manuscript of the work Kitab al-Khilaf, which is it recalls the difference between Ben Asher and Ben Naphtali. Right. So let's look at the Gaia first of all. First of all, on the verbs yihiyu, by yihiyu. Here we've got L is the Leningrad Codex, which is what you find in BHS edition. You see in this particular verse in Genesis 44, we've got no Gaia in L, but in Lailashi we have a Gaia, and also in a manuscript B or 4445 there is a Gaia. Now this will, you'll see in the next few minutes that this actually is a pattern, that the marking of the Gaia on major Gaia and the Haya and Haya marking conforms more to B than to L. Now, the point is that I would very much like to have showed you how it compared to A, that is the Aleppo Codex, but unfortunately, the Aleppo Codex doesn't contain the Torah, so we have to go with B. And B is actually thought to be the same date, and it is typologically similar in many other respects in terms of its vocalization to A. So, so now if you look at the marking of the major Gaia, which in most of the following examples are major Gaia, leaving aside now Haya and Haya, we find that typically where L, or very frequently where L has a major Gaia, Vayahalamu, for example, Lailashi and B agree in not having the major Gaia marked. So here is one example, Lelohim in L in Genesis 48, and Lelohim without the major Gaia in Lailashi and B. Similarly, Et Ha-Anavim, Ha-Anavim, we've got the Gaia on the Ha, but in L, but not in Lailashi or in B. And Vahashibcha, we've got a Gaia in L, but not in Lailashi or B. So the point is that this, therefore, Lailashi and B, one can say, are more economical in the marking of major Gaia. And this indeed is a feature of Aleppo Codex vis-a-vis the L. So one can argue, well, first of all, I don't want to make conclusions about origins, dates, and everything really. I just want to sort of look at the empirical data and look at the typology rather than genealogy of these of the Lailashi Codex. But essentially, its typology is closer to B and A than L, and that, if in terms of chronology, one could see, B and A are clearly 10th century and L is 11th century. The Cairo Codex is actually, the marking of major Gaia is actually even fuller than in L. And it's, first of all, this may be something to do with its date, because it is thought to be now 11th century, or it could be the fact that it conforms more to the, it seems, to the school of Ben Naphtali. Now, what about Chatif vowels and non-guttural consonants? Well, Tochalenu, we hear in L, we have Tochalenu. In this particular form, I haven't got time to explain why you would have a Chatif Patach here. Basically, it's marking the fact that in this particular form, the Shva is read as vocalic. Now, the point is that Aleppo Codex almost not regularly or very, very frequently marks such places with a Chatif Patach. It seems to be the kind of a feature which is of vocalization which is very much favored by Ben Asher, who was supervised the vocalization of A. Now, and you also get it in B, Tochalenu, with a Chatif Patach. L, it seems the original vocalization didn't have such Chatif Patach, not many of them, but they were added later through corrections to make them nearer to A. But Lailashi does not have the Chatif Patach. Now, this is significant typologically, because if you look further in the world of these model Masoretic codices, which actually my student Vince Byler has been doing, we see that, in fact, those manuscripts which Vince has from the Masora believe are close to the world of production of A, in other words, typologically close. I just checked with him actually the last couple of days. It's now appearing that those manuscripts which are close to A have Khatif Patachs very frequently. Therefore, the conclusion is that Lailashi is not as close to the world of production of A as, say, B is. So therefore, we've got two dimensions here. We've got the major Gayot, which looked like the world of A, but the Khatif Patachs are slightly different. So we've got a slight complication here. Now, and finally, because I know time's running out, Ben Asher versus Ben Naphtali, they have differences in very, very minor things, which probably most of you will never be concerned with, but it's basically marking of Gayot again, and this time the minor Gaya on short, closed syllables. Essentially, they differed on such things, mainly, a large proportion of their differences. Now, where does Lailashi stand here compared to L? Well, I mean, just to briefly say that basically Lailashi conforms to Ben Asher. In most cases I've checked, I haven't done a systematic check of everything. But there are occasional places I found, a couple of places actually, where Lailashi goes with Ben Naphtali instead of Ben Asher. So, and in such cases they deviate from L. So there's a slight lack of conformity to L in that respect. I won't show you the example. I just reported those results. These are the various differences. So I think that's all I have to say, really. But just my conclusion would be, well, I don't really have a conclusion about. I'm not going to talk about. I've just presented the sort of typologies, and I think the typology does have some significant detail to it, but it's complex in that there are some parallels with the world of A, 10th century, but there are also some indications that it wasn't quite in, if you like, the inner core of Tiberian model Merck Codex manuscript production. So yeah, I mean, I probably won't go any further than that. I mean, we can discuss later. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Geoffrey. I'd like to introduce Debra Band, who's a senior fellow of the Oxford Interfaith Forum. She's a distinguished visual artist, scholar of Hebrew illuminated manuscripts, calligrapher and illuminator. She's the author and illuminator of Kohelet, Searching for a Life Worth Living, and her paintings are widely exhibited across the United States and Canada. Debra, take it away.
Lovely, thank you. Great. I'm so grateful to Thea for inviting me to be with you this evening. I am a Hebrew manuscript artist in the Washington, D.C. area, working in both illuminated books and also ketubot. Now, despite more than half a century of fascination with Hebrew illuminated manuscripts, I really was a child when this obsession seized me. I knew absolutely nothing about this codex until my dear friend Ellen Davis at Duke University Divinity School acquainted me with Thea's work on it early last year. I'd like you to join me for a far painfully too brief whirlwind tour of the history of Hebrew illumination to give you a sense of the Lailashi's context among Hebrew manuscripts, especially early medieval Bibles, of course, and then focus on the extensive micrography found throughout its pages. Now, Jews are famously described as people of the book, and our books are at the core of Jewish civilization. In the Song of the Sea in Exodus, and as Moses and Israel praised God for the miracle of escaping slavery in Egypt via the miraculous parting of the Red Sea, the people sang, Zeh Kelivian Vehu, this is my God, and I will glorify him. And this phrase has become the rationale for the concept of Hidur Mitzvah, that is, beautifying a commandment, making the performance of a religious act an actual sensory pleasure. Now, Jewish law stipulates that Torah scrolls and a very few other types of texts must not be adorned by any extraneous imagery or words, but exquisite materials in calligraphy and even the casings are indeed highly valued. But outside of this narrow range of ritual scrolls, turning the books that carry our sacred texts into joyful pleasures to see and handle appears to have been a focus in the Jewish art since the advent of the bound book. Christianity and Islam, of course, have ancient and extraordinary traditions of illuminated manuscripts. And Alana Tahan of the British Library has observed that while the glorious illuminated books and documents of the two later Abrahamic religions were largely created by only the wealthiest, most powerful classes, their aristocracy and wealthiest religious institutions, in Jewish culture, illuminated books were commissioned by a somewhat more popular readership, generally merchant class families with both the scholarly values and financial resources to put into luxury books for their own use, or perhaps for rabbinic academies and the synagogues they supported. But not only the wealthy valued the manuscript arts. We can look at the history of illuminated Jewish marriage contracts and find many examples of documents decorated way beyond the needs of the required texts that may have been created for families and institutions of far less opulent means. So far as biblical codices are concerned, we should note that these decorated bound books could only be used for private or academic study, since, as I mentioned earlier, traditional Jewish law has consistently forbidden any decoration within scrolls intended for public congregational chanting. Despite the predations of time, heavy use, and anti-Semitic destruction, we still have a number of early biblical codices dating forward from around the 10th century. It's almost impossible to overstate the importance of these physical books that bear the text of the Bible in general. Indeed, the finest, most beloved biblical codices, which of course we believe carry the divine word, are traditionally called by the Hebrew word keter, or crown, which not only conveys worldly royalty, but also even an element of the divine. In Jewish mysticism that goes back very, very early, keter is the name of the highest, most hidden, most remote essence of the divine. Two of these volumes have been regarded in modern times as authoritative and are the basis for most modern Hebrew language Bibles. As we heard just now, the Codex Leningradensis and the Aleppo Codex. The Leningrad Bible, considered to have been copied in Cairo in the year 1008 of the Common Era, has been the basis for many modern Bible editions, and is understood from what I know to be the oldest complete Masoretic text. While the remarkable story of the Aleppo Codex, which dates from about 920 CE, lately received a fascinating treatment by Mati Friedman. A slightly earlier text, the Sassoon Codex, is almost complete but is rife with scribal errors and was missing altogether for 600 years, but has been used to check editions using the Leningrad text. Now, Thea reports that legends suggest that the Lailashi Codex was copied in the 7th or 8th century. And it would be remarkable indeed if the Lailashi could actually be proven to date from so early an era. Indeed, in the middle of the Masoretic movement, which stretched from the 7th to the 10th centuries. Now, let me show you, starting in just a moment, some examples of Hebrew illuminated manuscripts and codices through time that relate to the styles found in the Lailashi. Before I start, though, I want to define the term micrography, which we'll encounter frequently. Literally, this is, of course, Greek for tiny writing, but this medium originated with Hebrew manuscript artists, with examples going back very early in the roots of Hebrew illumination, as we'll see. Micrographic designs take lines of tiny, something like 2-point size handwritten text, and weave them into patterns and sometimes whole pictures. You can see a fine example here in the photograph from the Leningrad Codex. The tiny lines of writing surrounding the small gold droplets and triangles. Visitors to Tzfat often bring back whole pictures composed of micrographic texts of Book of the Bible, but sadly the writing in those is often far more slapdash than what you're going to see in any of the codices I show you here. A great many medieval Bibles that are otherwise undecorated end with pages of complex micrography, most often carrying the Masoretic notes on the biblical text, which needed to be there. But the scribes obviously assumed that no one was actually going to read them and simply had fun with it. I've seen manuscripts from the 10th, 11th century in the British Library, which unfortunately, due to last October's hack, are no longer available, that have pages and pages and pages of nothing but micrography at the end of these codices. I should add a note here about materials. Hebrew books have generally been accomplished on vellum, that is calfskin, or other soaked, stretched, but otherwise uncured skins from kosher animals. Ritually correct Torah scrolls require kosher slaughter, but bound books usually not. These are written in ink, painted in opaque watercolor, nowadays we call gouache, with illumination in gold or silver leaf and powder. The Lailashi is written on thick skins from evidently small animals, probably deer or lamb. Calligraphy for both medieval books for ritual scrolls and ritual scrolls is done either with a reed or a quill, carefully and very frequently cut to correct width and sharply beveled edges. I'm showing you now an example of a page spread of a 9th to 10th century Bible from Ilana Tahan's fine study of Hebrew illuminated manuscripts. Egypt, of course, was the home of important Jewish communities from Hellenistic times until the establishment of Israel. And the surrounding Muslim culture strongly influenced Jewish arts across the Muslim territories, especially in the preference for abstract geometric and vegetal design, rather than recognizable figurative imagery, in particular, anything remotely like human imagery. Here is an example of a spread from a very slightly later Persian or Babylonian Bible, and you can see rather similar characteristics. The abstract, rather than the figurative, vegetal and geometric patterns that you see in these images and saw before in the image I showed you from the Leningrad Codex testify to that influence. In contrast, here's a page from a 13th century Bible from Bamberg in northern Bavaria, which had an important medieval Jewish community. The scribal decoration here is far more figurative, if fanciful. And this page also shows a wonderful micrographic design of castles and turrets, such the scribe might well have seen in his own area. This Bible is a couple of hundred years later than those we've discussed so far, but the principle remains the same. Here's an image from another remarkable Keter. This is from the Damascus Keter, which, according to the scribe's colophon, was actually written in Burgos, Castile, in 1260. The name of the scribe was Menachem, son of Avraham, but the book was then moved to a synagogue in Damascus, stolen in 1940, but was found and eventually purchased by the National Library of Israel. There's a long adventure there. And again, you can see more micrography. Let's move ahead in time just a little bit and likely to Girona in the West. Here's another Haggadah from medieval Spain, albeit from the Christian area. This is near probably Girona in Catalonia. This is the Barcelona Haggadah from about 1340. Like most Hebrew illuminated manuscripts created in Christian lands, it includes extensive, fully figurative narrative imagery. Let's move forward to Renaissance Italy. Here's a gorgeous spread of pages from a mid-15th century Pentateuch, the Chumash, likely from Ferrara. We see exquisite technique, rich materials, lots of gold leaf and extensive color, including a fine grade of ultramarine blue, which until modern times was always the most expensive of all pigments, since it's ground from lapis lazuli, which has only ever come from Afghanistan. Nowadays, most ultramarine is synthetic, but I still use the real thing every now and then. You also see human imagery here, and the pages include Rashi's commentary on the text. Now, this is the beginning of Leviticus, Vayikra, indicating that this lovely volume was intended for private or academic study. It's worth noting here that although the text would certainly have been done by a Jewish scribe, it's quite possible, even likely, that the paintings might have been accomplished in a Christian studio, as many Italian Jewish illuminations were. Other than the little medallion that bears an image of maybe Moses, there's nothing particularly Jewish about the floral imagery in the decoration, but Hidur Mitzvah, embellishment of the commandment to study Torah, this book most certainly is. Now, it's time to tear us away from my beloved medieval manuscripts, although I haven't even begun to scratch the surface and have left out countless beloved paintings. Let me show you just a few pages from much more modern Hebrew illuminated manuscripts. I'm showing you a page from the Moss Haggadah, commissioned from the American artist David Moss. He's from Ohio, but has been living in Jerusalem for many years now. It was commissioned by a Florida physician in the mid-1980s. In the 1970s, David almost single-handedly had reinvigorated the mostly abandoned art of Hebrew manuscript illumination, but that is largely abandoned in the West at least, with his ketubot, or Jewish marriage documents. There are a number of pages of micrography in this Haggadah, and this illumination presents the phrase, "next year in Jerusalem," which is the formal ending to the traditional Passover Seder. The beautiful micrographic border is composed of 70 biblical verses containing 70 different appellations for Jerusalem, expressing Judaism's 2,000-year longing for a return to our capital. You can see that following the tradition of many medieval manuscripts, he uses the micrographic text to deepen the symbolic value of the overall image. This is a page of my own micrography from my most recent book, along with a close-up. This is the frontispiece for Kohelet, Searching for a Life Worth Living, that I did along with the Israeli philosopher Menachem Fish, published last summer. The book was published in 2023, but this page was actually done in 2020. The micrography here, worked in a classical medieval Mediterranean pattern, is the first third of the entire book of Kohelet, and the remainder is on the following 2 pages. I use illumination as a place to develop a coherent and wide-ranging visual midrash, probing the subtleties of whatever text I'm working with. And micrography of related texts is one of my tools. There's a great deal in my Kohelet, and I also include it frequently in my ketubot. This is my Hebrew illumination of Kohelet 4, 1-7, which deals with oppression. The micrography you see here is the first chapter of Lamentations, and the braid in which I've done it alludes to this biblical philosopher's statement that multiple people joined together can accomplish more than a single person. Now, lest you think that I must limit my micrography to biblical or rabbinic texts, in another painting in my Kohelet, I created a micrographic image of a dancer, and she is composed of the Italian lyrics of Verdi's aria Libiamo from La Traviata. Whatever helps me tease out the subtleties of the text. Now, needless to say, no artist can really expect, nor has ever expected, a reader to squint over the micrography. But the medievals couldn't really attach legible commentary to their works, but nowadays we can. And both David Moss and I append commentary to our works, explaining the symbolism in detail, enabling the reader to follow our ideas, and I include translations as well. So, having gotten a little bit of context here, let's look again at the Lailashi Codex. On the left of this slide, you see a text page from the Lailashi presenting the end of Exodus and the beginning of Leviticus. I began this presentation with this image, but let me share the reasons that I find it so fascinating from several perspectives. The calligraphy is done in a beautiful hand, slowly and carefully, with meticulously formed letters. This was not rushed informal work, highly skilled, and carefully sharpened reeds or quills. Now, I would bet on reed pens given the rigid angularity of the letters and a fine, consistently dark ink. You don't take any of these things for granted. Now, you can see the extensive, carefully drafted and written micrography, most likely, of course, are the Masoretic notes. Rachel Milstein has suggested that the design of the micrography symbolizes the light of God speaking to Moses and Israel at Sinai. I'm also really fascinated by the little painting. Keep in mind that this painting divides the book of Exodus, in which the tent of the meeting, the predecessor to the temple, is constructed, and the book of Leviticus, which of course focuses on the priestly laws. To my eye, the shape of this little painting looks like an allusion to either a temple or the classic four-horned altar with something resting on it. Look at the geometric pattern that it's made of. Now, look to the right. These are samples of the recent extraordinary finds of inlaid floor tiles from the Second Temple. The patterns are, of course, not quite the same, but I suspect this artist knew the Talmudic descriptions of the decorations, including the inlaid floors of the temple, and attempted to reproduce them as he introduced the biblical book focused on Levitical law. The Lailashi follows scribal tradition in its visual presentation of the Song of the Sea from Exodus, staggering the half verses to resemble brickwork, a visual symbol of the bricks that the Israelites were forced to make in Egypt. I'm also interested in the little special markings that signify the ends of the weekly Torah portions, the parshiot, or in Greek pericopes. The current system of divisions into chapters and verses are, of course, a gradual Christian innovation, chapters in the 13th century, verses in the 16th. Jewish tradition, however, divided the text into verses since the Masoretic movement. And the divisions of Torah portions have been all important since Talmudic times. Here are several examples of these little markings. I'm interested. I have a question here. The pei would seem to stand for parsha, but I don't know the intention of the taf unless it simply stands for Torah. And I'd love to discuss this if anyone has any ideas about this in the end. Now, the scribe also inserted markers for midpoints of biblical books and a marker for the midpoint of the 5 books of Moses, Chumash, altogether, as well as of significant points in the Tanakh. Let me wind up this all too brief presentation with pages from the Lailashi Codex, presenting the end of the book of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. These beautiful pages show the same careful and clear square calligraphy that we saw on other pages, extensive border micrography, likely of the Masoretic notes, and mark the division between the books with the geometric design in micrography in gold, closely related to imagery in the Leningrad Bible. So let this be an end of the beginning of far greater Western familiarity with this beautiful crown of the Georgian Jews. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Debra. I'd like to now just invite Dr. Thea Gomelauri, who's the inaugural director of the Oxford Interfaith Forum and associate faculty member of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oxford, just to say a few words in response to what we've been listening to.
Thank you very much, Ben. And first of all, I want to thank our speakers for taking the time and effort and to look into this issue. But before I offer few comments and ideas, I would like to take few seconds to reflect and to pay tribute to those heroes who risked their lives for saving those precious lives. The lives that we view on the screen are literally soaked in blood and tears. People who risk their lives for those pages are no longer with us, but luckily their generations are, and I would like to let them know how much we appreciate the sacrifices of their grandparents. Now, I would like to share a few images and to introduce a few ideas. Let me share my screen, and here we are. The story of Georgian Jews goes back to the 6th century BC. Where we have a chronicle here on depicted, which testifies when Jewish community came and settled in Georgia after the king Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem, and which is their first settlement, the place they called Zanavi from Hebrew. Professor Soltes mentioned the Jewish Christian origins, and Jews were the first Christians in Georgia who brought Christianity. Georgia is proud to house the holy robe of Jesus, and it was a Jew by the name of Eliezer who attended a Sanhedrin meeting in Jerusalem and bought the robe of Jesus from a Roman soldier and brought it back to Georgia. And he gifted it to his sister, who is buried with this robe. Georgian community is longest continuous living Jewish community in diaspora. The item I would like to show you doesn't have a label made in Georgia, but it was found in Georgia. And this is the golden amulet. Professor Soltes mentioned golden fleece. I suggest perhaps it's time to rename Georgia as country of golden amulet. And this is where it was found in a jar. And I'll just give you a very snapshot. We simply cannot go into the details, but here you see the transcription of the detail. Abraham ben Sarah, and here we have the text, what is written in the amulet. So this is, as I said, dated 5th century. And even things changed. If we see here, the poorest of poor, perhaps, the family, Jewish family, who doesn't have even table and a chair, only one chair where the head of a family sits. But you see what he's doing. He's holding a book, obviously the Holy Book, and reading this. So that gives you an idea how this education and scribal culture was appreciated. And even though we have very scarce evidences, I'll just show again the gravestone and the old photographs of the goddesses that have been destroyed and disappeared since then. Now, I would like now to point the most tantalizing question is the provenance of the codex. Was it produced, could that he produced locally, or was it brought from outside? In this book, I only refute some opinions that have been circulated, and I found them untrue. But I have not fully established the theory and explanation how this codex arrived. Therefore, I want to share with you few ideas which I have not shared in the book, because my opinion is still in the stage of formation. But as Debra just mentioned, at one hand, we have highly skilled scribes and expertise. But on the other hand, I want to show the material that he is working with. Now, just to give you a few examples, we see that highly qualified scribe is working with a very scarce materials. The parchment is very expensive. And when we are speaking now about provenance of the codex, the question is who commissioned it, who must, and then tracing the commissioner. In my search, it does not give any impression, because it would be counter logical to come to hire highest highly qualified scribe and not to pay for the good quality of parchment. Parchment we see here, he has to make those stitches and sew the pieces together. Here we see again, look, just again, you see this signs, which before he began, and look at the middle of the page, and this, and with this, look, that's. So before even he began to work, he really had to scrape material to make it work. So that gives us some hints and ideas, which I call that Lailashi Codex so far does not impress me as a commissioned work. It seems to me to be labor of love. The scribe who, at the end of perhaps his professional life, put all his resources together to produce this beautiful manuscript. We cannot go any further details, but I promise that more will be forthcoming, more information, and I'm very grateful for Professor Han, who will supervise. Lots of work is still ongoing. I would like to take this moment and use this wonderful opportunity I see in audience, Professor Geoffrey Penkover, and who produced a wonderful work, a magisterial work about reading of Zecher or Zeiters from about Amalek. Because Professor Han mentioned these textual peculiarities, and I want to make just only one point on the next one. And there is in this, here, this is the one. So far, Professor Penkover produced extensive research and concluded that there was no textual evidence to testify the reading of Zecher with Segol, and I was very excited to see that Lailashi actually presents that phenomena, and we'll need to look into more details perhaps. There are many, many nuances that will be coming, and I am so grateful to everyone who contributed. I want to reply to Debra's question. The parashas, yes, Pei and Tav. I write about it, Debra. This is the ligature. What we read as a letter Tav is actually Resh with one stroke of she, and he incorporates all three letters of Parashah, Pe, Resh, and Shit in one. Here over time, so if it's not absolutely necessary, perhaps we can keep the time and respect our speakers, if you don't mind.
Okay, in which case perhaps we should draw it to a close. And maybe just thank you to all our speakers today: Geoffrey Khan, Ori Soltes, Debra Band, and Thea Gomelauri. And thanks for so many people for turning up.
And thank you, Ben, for wonderfully cheering and guiding through it. Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.